Good day, and let's talk about donuts in Blender. Okay, enough Andrew impressions there. So a little bit about me. I've been working with Blender for about 18 years, and I'm really excited about 2.8. And just to kind of warm up with 2.8, I've been following along with BlenderGuru's donut tutorial. And one thing that I always see come up with this tutorial is, does anyone know how to make the spheres stop colliding, or the sprinkles stop colliding? And even when BlenderGuru gave a sneak peek of the donut series 17 days ago, one of the top comments was, some way of removing the intersecting sprinkles would be nice. And of course he said, there is no way to do this other than manual placement. Well, which is kind of true. But it looks like he's not going to address it. And manual placement is a little bit misleading. There is a way that you can do it. And the reason why he probably doesn't cover it is, well, one, it's probably not good YouTube content. And, it would be maybe boring to watch. It would just be a time lapse, probably. And the other thing would probably be, it might be overwhelming for beginners. So maybe he just wants to kind of ease you into Blender. But luckily, I don't have those standards. So I will show you how to remove the intersections. Now, one thing you might notice is that my Blender looks a little bit different than yours or other people who record, YouTube tutorials. And the reason is because I'm using a custom theme. This theme I made for about 2.78, and I've just carried it over. I converted it to 2.8, and I had to update some things so that it would be 2.8 compatible. I'm not a huge fan of dark themes, and I'm also not a fan of Blender's new light theme, so I had to make a custom theme. If you want this theme, I'll try to include a link in the description. And I'll also be showing you some other things towards the end of the video of how to make your life simpler in Blender, or just other improvements on the donut. So let's get started. So here is my progress on the donut. I've basically followed his tutorial to completion. So I think he calls it level 2, and he uploaded earlier today. And so here's my progress. If you're curious, here's my latest render. And so it looks like he's not going to talk about getting rid of the duplicates. So let's tackle that first before we go into some other things. So if we take our icing and we go to our particle system, you can see we have like all the settings for the particles. And, if we change the seed, like he was saying, we get a different distribution. If we change like the phase, it'll do stuff like that. And we can change the scale, but I like my settings where they are. And so the question is, what's happening here? Where are all these objects coming from? And obviously inside Blender there's some code which takes our kind of prefab sprinkles and puts them all over the place, duplicates them, rotates them. And this is the control panel for configuring that. But if you go to modifiers with the icing selected, you can see that the particle system is just a modifier. It has its own panel for configuring it, but it's just a modifier. Now, some modifiers, like if you put on a subdivision surface, whoops, it has its options right here. But the particle system is, so complex and advanced, it wouldn't make sense to just waste an entire panel for the particle system here. So it has its own tab for all of its crazy amount of settings. But if we go to this particle system, we can turn it off in the viewport, or we can leave it on. But there's this convert button. And when we click that, you'll see that there's now a bunch of objects in our outliner. And if we temporarily hide the icing, and we'll hide the donut too, we now have a bunch of objects that can be selected. So what we want to do is hide everything. So I'm going to hide the camera, I'm going to hide the environment. We only have the donut collection open. And then we have the archive and the sprinkles collection. So we just have the donut, but the donut and the icing themselves are hidden. So now if I hit A, I'll select all of those instances of the sprinkles, and we'll hit M, move to a new collection, and we'll just call this all dem sprinkles. All right, so now we can just kind of minimize that, and our outliner isn't too overwhelming. If we do want to see all of those sprinkles, of course we can open it up here. And you can see we have over 99 children or things in this collection. So now we can bring let's hide these sprinkles and let's bring our icing back. And you notice that the sprinkles came back. And that's because the particle system is still active. We converted it to a bunch of objects when we hit this button, but it's still an active particle system. So I'm just going to disable this, and now we don't see it in the view. I'll disable it from render as well, but I'm not going to delete it. Now, of course, what this means is that if we go to our particle settings and we were to change the seed or whatever, it's not doing anything. If we bring back our sprinkles, they're all basically baked into the scene now. They're all individual objects that can be selected individually, but the particle settings are no longer going to change them. If we do want to change them, we would have to just turn off or delete this collection, then go back to the particles, turn them back on again, and then we can start tweaking their settings again. But then you'd have to go here and hit convert again. So this is kind of a step that you do when you're very satisfied with your settings for the particle system, because you can't go back. You'd have to start over at this step if you need to make changes to any of the particle settings. But I'm going to leave these particles off now, and I will bring in our sprinkles. Whoops, no, all dim sprinkles. And what I want to do is in the outliner, right now we can, for example, select the icing. Let's bring the donut back. We can select the donut, we can select the icing, but what we're going to want to do is start selecting sprinkles. And what happens sometimes is you try to hit a sprinkle, but Blender will see the donut in the background, and you'll get the wrong selection. So what we're going to do is, in the outliner, we're going to turn on the cursor filter, and then we're going to turn off cursor for donut, and we're going to turn off cursor for icing. So now we can't actually select those anymore, but we can select the individual sprinkles, and so that makes it easier for us to basically accomplish what we're going to do next. So for example, I don't like it when the balls touch, so I'm going to move this guy over, and we can just kind of hit period to focus on it, and then just rotate the camera and just place it down somewhere where it's not overlapping with something else. Now, what BlenderGuru is saying is, no way to do this other than manual placement. Well, when I think manual placement, what I'm kind of thinking is you take one of your sprinkles, you duplicate it, and then you place it somewhere. And that would be pretty exhausting to manually place every single sprinkle on the donut. But what we can do is we can manually fix some of the intersections. And that's actually a lot easier. It goes a lot quicker. So I'm going to separate these ones. I'll put them somewhere over there. And so now we have those kind of balls separated. I'm going to move them out just a little bit more because right now their distribution is kind of too clumped together. Okay, so that looks good. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to go in and delete some of the offenders, basically. And that's a way, like, for example, do we really need this sprinkle here? Just hit X, deleted. This one that intersects through many of them, deleted. Maybe we'll move this one over here somewhere, bring it up. And now here's another trick, too, is if we hit R, we rotate in screen space, basically relative to the camera angle. So if we focus on this and rotate like this, it's different than going top view and rotating. Let me hide this there so you can see my screencast keys. But if you're at some random view angle, if you hit R twice, you can actually kind of trackball rotate, and that will allow you to resolve a lot of conflicts. Like this one, I can just move like that, and now it looks like it's laying on top of the other one. Maybe bring it up a little bit. And so I think, this is probably why BlenderGuru doesn't tell you that you can actually fix it, is because it's just a bunch of manual tweaks like this, which probably, doesn't make for great YouTube content. But, if you put on a song you like, some music in the background or something, you can really just kind of get in the zone and start fixing up a lot of these issues. This is way easier than having to manually place all of the sprinkles because they're already pretty close to good. You just have to go in and fix some of the ones where they're egregiously bad. But it's not too hard to go in and fix them. The only gotcha is, if you're moving something, you move it over here, you might accidentally move it where it's hovering. So you always have to be mindful that when you're going to put it on the surface, just bring it down a bit. And, if you can see the whole thing not intersecting with icing, there's probably a good chance that you've left it floating somewhere. That one turned out to be fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and fix up all of these. And, just one by one, going in and, if, let's say we don't like this one, we'll just, in some cases you can just delete them. Some cases you can move them, and other cases you can just go in and delete them. I like moving them because I'm pretty fast with the keyboard shortcuts in Blender. But look at this, there's a huge pile there. We could probably get rid of 3 of those and still be fine. So it's not like you have to, always move every single one. A lot of times you're just going to be deleting where there's a clusterfuck happening because there's too many. And other times, if it feels natural to separate them, you can. And so, yeah, I'm going to keep recording this and probably edit it into a time lapse because I don't want to bore you guys with me fixing every single one of these. But you get the idea, and so I'll be taking note of how long this takes me. So right now it's 4:33, as you can see, and so let's just see how long it takes me to clean up everything. All right, so it's been 11 minutes, and I think I'm pretty good. Now, I've gone all the way around once. There's probably still some that are overlapping, but it already looks a lot better. And you're looking at my screen right now, and you might say, well, what about, for example, these ones? They're still intersecting. But if you look, they're kind of laying on top of each other. So in a case like this, I might just rotate that to be a little bit more extreme. But you do kind of want them to be on top of each other sometimes. This is another example of a really complex area. I could probably stand to get rid of this one, but all of these other ones, they're kind of just laying on top of each other. And that's, that's intersection, but it doesn't look as egregious as, for example, this. So I probably missed this one on my first pass, and there's probably many that I miss. But I got a lot of them. So I'm going to rotate this one and just delete this one. One thing that I noticed I was doing, here's another good example of where they're kind of organically piled on top of each other. It looks pretty cool, I think. So I'm just going to rotate them a little bit so that they're not intersecting, but they don't look as bad as when they're just straight going through each other. And so, some of the tweaks I was doing, like I said, I was using the trackball to rotate, the trackball method, or just the regular rotate method. But I was trying to delete similar colors when I saw similar colors nearby. So if there's a big pile of sprinkles and it was a bunch of green and then one yellow that was intersecting, I would delete a green. And most of this cleanup was done by deleting. So in some cases I would grab and move one, but many of the times I was just deleting excess sprinkles that didn't need to be there. And so it took 10 minutes for my first pass, and now I'm doing my second pass with you guys. And I'm also looking for any that I might have accidentally left floating. I was pretty careful about that, but I mean, sometimes, everybody makes mistakes. But yeah, this is my second pass through. This guy's probably buried a bit too much. I'll just bring him up a bit. And it's looking good. I mean, I definitely left some clusters in there. I didn't want it to be just sprinkles that were sparse and far from their neighbors. But I tried to just delete duplicates or delete when there's a bunch overlapping. And for the second pass, I'm not really seeing too many. I mean, obviously you're watching me fix problems right now, but compared to the first pass, it's a lot better looking. Let's just move this guy up there. Bring him up a bit. So yeah, it's most I would say 90% of my fixes were just using the X key to delete stuff. And then in some cases where I wanted to maintain the aesthetic of piled sprinkles, I would go in and rotate or maybe move, for example, this one. I like this green guy being there, so I could either rotate this guy up so he's sitting on top of it, or I could have moved him just out of the way. But most of the fixes I did during the time lapse was just the delete key, which is X in Blender. I was just deleting a bunch of stuff, and now, we're almost done. The second pass is going pretty quick. Oh, here's a place where I fucked up. So in this case, we already have two yellows right next to each other. I'm just going to delete this one. Just hit X and delete it. There's no point. I mean, I could try to place it and make it look nicer, but I mean, I feel like we already have enough variety. This one, these look like they're intersecting, but they're really not. This one stops there. This one's buried in, and this one's sitting on top of it. So this place, this looks kind of weird. I'll move this one out of the way. Again, these just look like they're resting on top of each other, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, I think, have we done a whole second pass? We might have. And sometimes I'm just tweaking. Yeah, I remember seeing this one when I came back from the time lapse. So there we go. So now, if we go to our rendered view, it took about 15 minutes of just going around and deleting the excess sprinkles, or rotating and kind of casually placing some of the other sprinkles. And I think the reason why BlenderGuru doesn't show you this is because if you're new to 3D modeling it, you might find it frustrating that you have to go in and manually move a bajillion sprinkles, or, well, you don't really have to move that many, but you have to go and delete a bunch, which can get tiring, and maybe he doesn't want to spoil the magic for you, especially since, I've been using Blender for a while, so I know the hotkeys pretty well, and I can go in and rotate them with, like I said, you press R twice to do the trackball mode, or R once to do the screen space rotation. So, once you're familiar with the grab and the rotate hotkeys, it's pretty easy to go in and clean up the sprinkles, but I feel like maybe he felt it was too advanced or something for beginners. But in case anybody does want to try, it took me about 15 minutes. It's like 3 or 4 of your favorite songs just playing in the background, and you'll be in good shape in no time. So I'm going to pause recording, do a render, and then we'll see what this looks like after that. All right, here is our render. Now, looking at it up close, there's still a few places that I could fix. For example, I could probably rotate this yellow one. This is kind of clipping a little bit too ugly. That should move over. Same thing here. But overall, when you look at the render, there is surprisingly few places that I would want to adjust. And here I have the render, and compared to the previous render, this is what it looked like before. It looked really noisy, just a lot of slop, a ton of places where things are intersecting. These cross ones are the ones that bother me the most, but there's all these little piles, the balls are touching, you have all of these places where it's just complete and utter nonsense for intersections. And then after 15 minutes of just starting here, working my way around the donut, I deleted so many, but then also rotating them just gently, or maybe sliding them over a bit and then making sure that they're still touching. It really was 15 minutes to go from this mess to this, which looks pretty clean. And so for anyone who's trying to make their donut renders look better, I hope this video helps you out. And I'll still probably do another pass just to fix up some of these things that are bothering me, but I won't do that on camera. All right, now that we have our donut with the sprinkles mostly fixed, there's one bit of housekeeping we still need to do, just as a quality of life convenience. So as it stands right now, we have our donut, and as a child of the donut is the icing. So if we move the donut, the icing moves with it. And if we move the icing, well, the sprinkles don't move with the icing anymore. And this can become a problem because, as Andrew mentioned in his video today, he's going to be going on vacation, but there's going to be more donut content when he comes back. And we're probably going to have to put the donut on top of a plate, move it around, rotate it, stuff like that. And obviously you can't, be expected to move the icing and then move every sprinkle with it. So we can fix this. Now, right now, all the sprinkles are in a collection, and we're going to leave them in that collection. But if we push Shift-C, it puts our 3D cursor right at the center of the viewport. And what we're going to do is hit Shift-A for add, go down to empty, and choose plane axis. And it will give us this giant thing that has lines in 6 directions. And I'm just going to scale that down until it's roughly about the size of the hole. Bring it up a bit with grab and Z. Scale it down until it's about there. Maybe bring it up a little bit more. And just out of good habit and practice, for the item, its scale is now that. So with the plane axis still selected, Control A and say Apply Scale, so it's back to 1, 1, 1, which is just a good habit to get into. And so what is an empty? Well, it's basically an object that has no mesh data. So instead of a mesh data, it just draws this little spiky thing. And there's other things you can do too. You can do arrows or single arrow or circle or whatever. But the traditional one is the plane axis. And I think that used to be the only one that Blender supported many years ago. But now it's just it's kind of the default one. So we put that there. Let's temporarily hide our lighting, our environment, the donut, and the icing. And we should be in this collection, all dumb sprinkles, and we should have the empty selected. So what we can do now is on the collection, right click and say select objects, and that will select all your sprinkles. And then hold shift and click this empty. It might deselect, but click it again and make sure it's the last thing you clicked. And in Blender, you'll see the outlines for these objects are a little bit darker. If I were to click this one, its outline is now brighter because it was the last one I clicked. If we go back to our empty, it's now brighter. So we want to make sure that's the last one selected. The same is true in the outliner. All of your objects that are selected are dark orange, or it might be different colors on your theme, and then the last one selected is a little bit brighter. And with this one selected, we're going to hit Control P for parent, and we're going to say keep transform. And that will draw a bunch of these lines, which we can get rid of in the overlays. Relationship lines, that's this, it just adds clutter. I don't like to have it. And now, if we move this empty, all the sprinkles move with it. And you can see all the sprinkles are now children of that. So we'll just double click here and call this sprinkles parent. And then we can now show our icing again. And with the icing, we will take this empty and we will parent it to the icing. So make sure the icing is the last thing selected. Parent, keep transform. And now if we move the icing, all the sprinkles move with it. If we rotate the icing, the sprinkles go with it. And so now we can just take this collection, put it underneath the donut collection because it's related to the donut. And now, if you expand here, you can still see all the sprinkles, but they're contained in this parent. So let's bring our donut back and our environment back. And I'm going to make it so we can't click on the environment because I don't want to be able to select that. So now we can move the donut around, we can rotate the donut, and all our sprinkles go with it. There's one other thing that we can do just to make things a little tidier, is we can take this plane axis, and in the object data menu, we can go to visibility and choose show in viewport false. So now we don't even see it. It's like it's not even there. This is basically, as good as you're going to get to where you were with the particle system. Now you might ask, why did I put all of the sprinkles under an empty called sprinkles parent? Why did I do that? Well, the reason why is that when you expand this, you have a billion objects in your outliner, which is really frustrating because you can't even scroll to the bottom of it. There's like 631 objects. So when we parented it to the icing, what that would have meant is, let's say we took the sprinkles and just parented them directly to the icing. We could have done that. But then when you expand icing, now your outliner has 630 objects to scroll through. But by putting them in this parent, this empty object, we can still parent to the icing. But when we expand icing, you don't overwhelm your outliner. You don't have a million things to scroll through because they're hidden in here. You can see there's over 99 things. Now you could say, well, they were already in the collection. why don't you just parent the collection to the icing? Well, that's not a thing you can do. Collections are basically like layers in Blender. They can be nested, but they can't be parented to actual objects. So we put all the sprinkles in this collection, but in order to parent them to the icing, they need to be in something like an empty. So they're parented to the empty, which is parented to the icing. So now we can move everything. And when we expand the icing, it doesn't like go and like, show a million things. So with that out of the way, and the other thing too is if you're in the outliner, you can't really hide an empty. Like if we're over here and you click on this empty, you can hide it, but it won't hide the sprinkles. It'll just hide the empty. But we've already hidden it down here. So if you want a quick way to hide all the sprinkles, you can just hide their collection. And that makes it easier to work with them. All right, and so that finishes the segment about fixing up the overlapping and intersecting sprinkles. Like I said, there's still probably a few that I could tweak, but 15 minutes plus a little bit of maintenance in the outliner, and we're now good. So there were some other ideas I wanted to talk about in this video while I have your attention. And let's talk about some of those things. So if you've been watching the BlenderGuru donut tutorial series, he posted his last video in level 2 today. And we were basically making a not too complex, but an interesting shader for the donut material. So we have a couple noise textures, which are combined together. They're used for the bump displacement, but they're also used to mix in a little bit of color. And it all goes to this principled BSDF shader. And so here we have that. Let me go to my shading tab. If we select my donut, I have basically what he did here. Now mine looks a little bit different. Again, I have a custom theme because I like kind of teal and purple. But I have bendy lines. And one thing that Blender 2.8 introduced is, well, it didn't introduce it, but it just made straight lines default. And I don't like these straight lines. I feel like it's harder to read for some reason. I really like it when the lines kind of flow into each other. Maybe it's just me, it's a personal preference, but if you do like bendy lines like I do, I'll show you how to get those back. So if you go to Preferences, and you go to Themes, and you go to Node Editor, and you scroll to the bottom, there's one thing called Node Curving, or Noodle Curving, sorry. If you go all the way to the left, it's 0, and you get the straight lines. And if you go all the way to 10, you get these very extreme tangent-looking curve lines. But if you stay at 5, you get these nice, sine curve-looking lines. And so by default, Blender 2.8 has it at 0. I don't know why, I just find this way more difficult to read. But if you go to your preferences and you set this to 5, you'll get these nice bendy lines. But here is basically the shader that he had us set up. This is the version that I did when I was following through the tutorial. But then when you click on the donut, there's almost nothing there. There's just this single principled BSDF and nothing else. Of course, we tweaked some of the settings like the subsurface color and distance and the roughness and stuff like that. But it's kind of funny that we went to the trouble of making this beautiful displacement map for the cake part of the donut and adjusting its colors, and then the surface for the icing is perfectly smooth. It's flawless. And one of the secrets to photorealism is imperfections. So if you were just here for the sprinkle intersection problem, we're going to move on from that now, and I'm going to have some fun maybe making this shader a little bit more advanced just so we can have some better looking icing. So if we look at some donut close-ups, you can see that there is high frequency noise. There's all kinds of little tiny dots and holes and dimples and stuff on the surface of frosting. In this case, it looks like it's probably been left out for too long and it started sweating, condensation or whatever. But in other cases, it's fine surface detail. One thing with this type of frosting too is when it's fresh, it's a lot glossier. But as it sits out for 15-20 minutes and the air gets to it, it starts to turn waxy. And when you have waxy frosting, you can have scratches and cracks and little imperfections on the surface. It's not going to be perfectly smooth. And here we can see that again. This is a little bit more of a chocolatey kind of chalky looking texture, but it still has all kinds of little high frequency details. It has cracks here on the surface, and so I thought let me see if I can try to recreate that. So here we have a scratch map, and you can just search for scratch map texture. There's a bunch of them. If you're looking for a good scratch map, the secret is don't have ones with watermarks in there. But the way that a scratch map is going to work is that the areas that are darker will look like cuts in the surface or scratches. Now, some ones like this might work well for like maybe some metal, like you could imagine like a Razor scooter or something. Like the metal pipes would have like a bunch of scratches on that. But this looks too procedural. Looks like someone just made a bunch of line tools in Photoshop or Illustrator or something. But I looked through this and I decided I liked this one. It's subtle. There's variance in the types of scratches. Some are curved, some are straight. It's not overwhelming. So I chose this one. So in Blender, let's create a new texture node for an image texture. We'll go to Open, choose our scratch map. And with Node Wrangler, we can click on that and see the texture. Now, I'm going to hide the sprinkles for now, and so we can just hide the collection. And what I want to do is make this texture too stretched out. I want to make it a little bit more like duplicated over the surface. So let's do that. Let's create a texture coordinate input node, and then create a vector mapping node. And we're going to take the generated texture coordinates and put it into vector right here. And then we're going to take the vector from the mapping and put it into the scratch map. And you can see it changed a little bit, but it's still too stretched. But if we go to the scale here, you can click on 1 and change it to like 0.25 or something. Why is my numpad not working? There we go. And you can see it creates more detail in this direction, but to save time, you can just click and drag over all three. So just go like that. And then you can type 0.25 and go to texture. Sorry, you have to click on texture there. And now you have a much finer repeating pattern. So you can just select all these. If you did 2, it'd be twice the size. But if we make it like 0.1, it repeats even finer. So let's try 0.3 maybe. I think that looks pretty good for our scratches. And just like we did before, we will create a displacement. And let's move these nodes down so they're kind of like more central. And we will take this and put it into the height of the displacement node. Now, one thing you want to do for good results is in the RGB, you choose non-color, because we're using this as a height map. We're not using this as a color texture. And then we'll have our displacement go over here into displacement. So now if we node wrangle on this, you can see in the look dev preview, that's actually pretty noisy. Let's do something like, I don't know, 0.001, something like that. Even that probably looks too deep, but let me show you a trick to speed up rendering. Now, I'm recording a video, so I'm going to temporarily put this on CPU because I think it kind of interferes with the video recording software when it's using the GPU. But if we hit rendered, it's going to take its dear sweet time. Oh, let's put our lights back in to render the whole scene. Let me go to my camera view. By the way, if you push 0 on the numpad, it takes you to the view of your camera, which is kind of cool. But it's taking its time to try to render. So what you can do is hit Control B, and then it gives you this selection box, and you can select just a small part of the screen to render. You can still rotate the camera, but once you're in here, you're just going to see this. Now, if you're in the viewport, not the camera perspective, you can do the same thing. You can just hit Control B and choose some random slice. And you can rotate, look around, and only this part of the screen will be rendered, and it's much faster. So when you're doing previewing, especially for stuff like materials, I find it's a lot easier just to select a small part of the screen to test with, instead of like having to render the whole donut, for instance. So yeah, that's just Control B. You can change it multiple times. And so let's look at this area here. I think the scratch map's probably still too big. Let's go down to 0.25. Whoops. My numpad is breaking. 0.25. Yeah, I like that better. And then I still think this is too strong. So let's just try adding... I think it was that. Let's try that. And that is perfect. Like, you can still see little scratches here and there, but they're not like the focal point. Maybe a little bit bigger. Let's try 2. Okay, I like that. So you can see that the surface is now imperfect, but it's not like deep gashes. All right, and so the other thing too is, I noticed that there is like high frequency detail noise in there. So just like we did before, we'll create a noise texture. And let's Shift Control click on that for Node Wrangler. And we will make this about 1,000. And I want high contrast on this. So just like BlenderGuru showed you, we're going to create a color ramp, put the factor in there, Node Wrangle on this, and just bring this to about here. And why? Oh, I guess it's working. There we go. There we go. Beautiful. So now we have like a bunch of little spots, but there's not a lot of variance. It's just either pretty much black or white with a little bit of gray in between, but not a huge amount. And just like we did, again, before in the cake material, we're going to add a color mix RGB. We'll Node Wrangle on this. And the values that I found to work for here is to set this to value and to set this to about 0.3. Maybe a little bit stronger, but you get some of those high frequency things in there. So when we go back to our material, I might have to increase my viewport sample so we can get a better look at this. Wow, my numpad, stop. The 2 key really does not want to work. All right, so as it's starting to get up to 128 samples, we can still barely see the scratches, but that's kind of what we want. And then there is now a high frequency detail on the surface. Now, another thing that I thought about doing was increasing transmission. Now, transmission is how you make translucent materials. So not necessarily clear materials, although it does play into making clear materials, but it's how you make translucent materials. So imagine if you take a piece of paper. You can't see through the paper, it's not clear, but if you hold it up to the window, light will still go through the paper. And I think that when you look at some of these donuts, the frosting isn't perfectly opaque. Now, in some cases, like you can see here where it thins out, you could actually see the donut through the icing. It's not completely thinned out, but it is somewhat thinned out. And I feel like, especially around the edges, you can start to see it. So it does let a little bit of light through. And in some cases, that's why we have the subsurface, because that's supposed to mimic light that enters the surface and then bounces around. But I've found that I think it looks a little bit better with a small amount of transmission on it. So let's just crank transmission to the max. And you'll see what almost looks like jelly or jam at this point. And let's just, if you want to cancel this box render, you just hit Alt-B, or sorry, Control-Alt-B, and it'll just bring the whole scene back. So this looks like, a jelly donut or something at this point. So that's probably a little bit too much, I would say. And then, if you wanted to start to make it clear, you could change alpha, and then it really starts to look like slime or something. But We don't want to do that. But I think that maybe some small amount of transmission would probably help it look better. And let's just speed things up here. And I think the scratch map should probably be maybe like this. All right, so, and another thing too is because we now have some transmission on there and we have the subsurface, our donut's going to probably lose a little bit of its color, so I'm just going to bring this up, make my pink a little bit pinkier. And let's give this a full render with the sprinkles and with everything and see how this looks now. So I'm going to go to my camera view, also clear this here, Control-Alt-B. Of course, make sure to save before rendering. And I'm going to hit render here, and then I will pause, and we'll be back when the render is done. All right, and so here we have our render. And you can see it looked pretty, it works pretty well. We have like a couple of those scratches. They could be like cracks as the frosting hardens. We have that high surface detail, or that high frequency surface detail, just like we saw on the real donuts. And I think it pairs better with the cake. The cake has all this really interesting surface, and then this previously was just flat. Of course, it's still pretty flat, especially if you look at it at a distance, but it now has some very subtle surface detail, which I think makes it look a lot better. And of course now our sprinkles aren't intersecting as much anymore either. But let's take a look at it side by side. Here was what we had previously. Let me just open this up here. So this was what we had before. As you can see, there's no surface detail, no scratches or cracks, and it looks uncannily smooth. But now, if we go to the right, we have this. So before and after. Now, one thing is, because we added transmission and because we added a bunch of high frequency displacement, we lose some of the gloss there, and I kind of like having that gloss, so I'm going to go see if I can get that back, but I like the improvement so far. So right now, if we select our icing, I will take just a small part to look at. So we could just turn our roughness down. And start to reclaim. At this point, the roughness can probably go all the way to 0 because we're creating virtual roughness with our displacement. So let's see how that looks now. And I'm just going to hide the donut because I do not want to see it. We'll also hide everything except for just the frosting so that we could really focus on that. So it does look shinier now. But, you know, it's not like a mirror shiny either. But I feel like if we were to, for example, unplug this displacement, so it's looking okay. At this point, though, I have the roughness turned down so much that it's starting to look like a mirror, which really isn't the way to go. So let's see if we can dial this back in here. Perhaps I can use a little bit less transmission. Okay, I think I like that better. We have those highlights. The highlights were pretty diminished in this one. I mean, they're almost entirely gone, but they were never super sharp. And it looks like we kind of have, those highlights back again. And we still have the displacement. I just had too much transmission on there, so too much light was going through it instead of reflecting off it. We did make it a little bit less rough, but not. We could probably go down a little bit more too, but not so much that it's was reflecting like a mirror. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's bring back everything. Go to camera view, clear our box with Control-Alt-B. All right, I'm going to pause again and give that another render. All right, just a quick update. So I accidentally made a mistake. When I was trying to fix the icing, I unplugged the displacement, or so I thought. I actually ended up unplugging it on the donut. So I just waited through a render. It took about 10 minutes or so, and the donut looks boring. But also, the frosting isn't fixed. It's not really what I was going for. In some places, it looks a little bit brighter. And overall, it's brighter. The frosting does have more light reflecting. But it still doesn't have these kind of highlights, which is what I was hoping to bring back. And I think I figured out the problem. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So here's our frosting selected. And the problem is, I thought that maybe... Well, what's going on now? Now it looks even... more different. Because we're not in. We got to go to cycles. And what I thought was happening is I put transmission on it, which I thought, okay, the light's going to be going into the icing and therefore reflecting less. But actually, I thought I had tried this, but I didn't. So if we remove the displacement map, immediately we get those highlights back. And what's happening here is if you dial up roughness to very high, it's as if the surface is rough, so you don't get those highlights. If you dial the roughness to 0, then the surface becomes like a mirror, and it looks very shiny. The problem is, with this displacement map, we're creating actual roughness. So when we put this in there, even though our roughness here is set to be a mirror, it appears as if the roughness is over here somewhere. And that's because this high frequency detail, if we node wrangle on this guy, all of those little tiny bumps are creating a very rough surface. So even though we're not using the fake roughness, well, it's not fake, but the principled BSDF shader roughness, our displacement map is creating roughness by the virtue of the fact that it's very rough. So that's what's happening there. I thought it was because of the transmission, but I was wrong. And I also forgot to put on the displacement for the donut. So we're going to try to see if we can fix this and then do another render. So here's the combined map with the scratches and with the roughness. And I think if I just take this down even more, we'll have more of the scratch, less of the roughness. And hopefully when we connect our main shader again, now we'll start to get those highlights back while still maintaining the surface detail that's interesting. So let's do just this area here. So that looks like what I want. We have some transmission still, but the roughness from the actual noise has been turned down. So now we're starting to get those highlights again, which is what I was looking for. I'm still, and now this roughness is awkwardly, at 0. So I feel like that might be too much. It should have probably some roughness here. But that just means we'll have to turn this down even more. Because we still want that surface detail. I don't want to just completely turn this off, because then you only have the scratches. And you can see immediately that the reflection is pretty strong. But it looks like 0.1 is kind of what I want. We still have those highlights, but we will also have the surface detail. So, now that everything is fixed, Let's bring back the whole render. I'm going to pause yet again and do yet another render. All right, now we have a render that looks pretty close to what I want. The cake donut now actually has its displacement maps on there, but also if we zoom in, we can see the imperfections, and we can also see the high frequency detail. I'm actually a little bit disappointed. I was hoping the high frequency detail would be a little bit more noticeable. So there might be one more change that I'm going to make, but for now, I think it looks good. I like these highlights. I like how these highlights, look wet, but not like a mirror reflection. I think the in addition to the subsurface scattering, the transmission makes it look a little bit better, a little bit more frosting-y like. And yeah, I like these scratches. It looks like it could be cracking apart at any moment. And you might think, like, a scratch map is normally something that you put on a hard surface object, like, a table or something made of plastic. But if you look at this photo reference, I mean, the surfaces really do get kind of messed up. And I think probably part of it is just as moisture leaves the icing, it cracks, just like, you see like a desert crack or dry skin crack or something like that. It's probably something like that. I don't think someone's going in here with a bunch of razor blades and marking up the surface, but I think cracks and creases naturally form as it's exposed to the air. And you look at this one, and this surface is all kinds of details on it everywhere, all kinds of little imperfections and cracks and stuff like that. So I think it seems weird to be using where's my render, a scratch map. But then when you look at actual pictures, the frosting kind of does do that. And if you're looking at it from a distance, I really think that does add a little bit of character. Maybe you don't want to use this scratch map. Maybe there's a better scratch map that you could use. It should be more like cracks than necessarily scratches, but I am happy with how this looks. But I do want to see more of that high frequency noise. You definitely can see it, but the problem was, the high frequency noise was literally making this a rough surface, so it was diminishing some of these reflections. So instead, we'll cheat and we'll do it in color. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to put a border render right around here. Sometimes when it's like super laggy, it's hard to select your border. There we go. And just like BlenderGuru showed us, I'm going to select the icing, and I'm going to create a mix RGB. And then we can take this, well, we don't really care about the scratches in this case, so I'll take just the noise and see if I could... Hold on, I'm going to switch this to CPU. I notice it lags a lot less when I'm using CPU mode, so I think it's while I'm screen recording. So I'm going to put this into FAC. And you can drag and drop color swatches in Blender. So if you just click and drag this, you can drop it in there. And then you can click and drag it, drop it in there. And then now we can just go and make this one a little bit darker. So if we look at this node, now we have that high frequency detail. And I'm just going to make this even darker still. And then we'll plug that into there. And now when we render, hopefully we'll get some of that high frequency detail, but we'll still have our nice reflections. And this is pretty much perfect. Like, I can see right now there's that highlight right there. We have the scratches, but we also have the high frequency detail. This might be a little bit dark. Now, one thing that I think is cool is right now we have this render box here, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Let's try to get like that area. But I'm in my camera perspective right now. So instead of having to wait for a full render, I'm just going to hit F12, and you'll notice that it will render just this piece. And so I think my rendering settings are at 512 samples for rendered mode, whereas my viewport is only 128. But because I don't have to render the whole scene, which normally takes about 10 minutes, and I'm just going to render this bit of surface on the donut, it'll probably almost take us just a couple minutes. In fact, I'm not even going to pause the recording this time. I'm just going to keep talking while it does its thing. Now, the reason why I have so many of these little rendering boxes is because I'm on I think it's 8-core CPU with 16 logical cores hyperthreading. It might be 6 cores with 12 logical. I forget, but I have a lot of CPU cores, to say the least. And so when you do CPU rendering, each one of those cores is given its own box. And so that's why I have so many of those boxes. If you're used to GPU rendering, usually you have less of these tiles. But it looks like we're on our last one, and our render time has only been, 1 minute 15 seconds remaining, and there we go. So now I can zoom into just this part, and I can see already that you have that kind of high frequency detail. It looks a lot better than the previous render, which is down here, where it was a lot flatter. It looks like we're starting to get that high frequency detail in there that I was hoping to get. So I think I'm going to do a full render with these settings, but I think I'm going to make the gashes even subtler. Just a little bit. I think we're at 0.2 right now. 3. Let's do 2. Maybe even 1. I have the right material, right? Yes. All right, perfect. Let's give that a render. All right, so we've finally done rendering. Now, in the meantime, since I paused and hit render, I actually went back and did several more renders. I just didn't record all of them. One thing that I did is I rendered just inside this rectangle, which gives you files where it just renders that bit. And so instead of having to render the entire scene every single time, I actually saved time by only rendering the part that I was changing, and then in Photoshop I would just go in and add that layer over, and I didn't have to re-render the background or the shadow or the cake. But look at it, this is pretty much exactly what I wanted. You can still see the cracks and scratches. You have nice light reflecting, but it's not reflecting like a mirror. And when you zoom in, you do have that that high frequency detail, just like we saw on real donuts. And it's kind of funny because normally cycles creates noise if you don't have enough samples, and this is basically a noise map, but that's what it looks like in real life. And I think when you look at it zoomed out, it looks a lot better. It gives you the impression that the surface is imperfect. It doesn't quite look like cycles noise. So if we want to see the before and after, here is what we started with, and then now we have this. Of course, when I added the noise, I had to play with the colors. I had to, let's select the icing here, I ended up using 2 very similar colors. Originally, I had high contrast between the colors, but that just made it look even more noisy. This one, believe it or not, is slightly brighter than this one, and that's enough to get the surface that I wanted, where it looks like it has some noise, but it's not completely overwhelmed. And also, this is still affecting the displacement a little bit as well. So it's a subtle effect, but I'm really happy with this result. So that's going to do it for this tutorial. Now, one thing I'm going to continue exploring on my own is I noticed that when the sprinkles get stuck into the icing kind of forms around them, and you can see that more clearly here. Like the icing's actually kind of raised around where the sprinkle is. There's definitely an interaction between the surface of the icing and the sprinkles that are embedded into that icing. Here you can see it's just like hugging around the sprinkle. And I'm super happy with this render, but the sprinkles just seem to be intersecting or clipping into the icing. They don't seem to be having that interaction. And I have an idea for how I could possibly achieve that, but I'm not going to play with it anymore for right now. But if I do achieve that, I will be sure to make a video on it. Anyways, I hope this this helps anybody who is trying to prevent their sprinkles from overlapping, and I hope you enjoyed the bonus content of me coming up with a new icing shader, or at least building on the one that BlenderGuru started. This is a new channel that I just started. I find myself recording Blender videos often, usually to help out friends or to help out people online. If I see a Reddit post asking for help, sometimes I'll record like a 2-minute video. I might do some tutorials, but I'm probably just going to be doing little quick Blender snippets here and there. Now, traditionally, I've uploaded it to my other channel as private videos because without context, they don't make much sense. It's just me going into a Blender scene and fixing something, and then that's that. So what I might try to do now is when I do a recording, do a quick little summary of what the problem is and then how to fix it. And that way, instead of just uploading a private video where, you know, nobody sees it except for the OP that I was talking to, instead, I'll be able to share it with a wider audience. And even if that wasn't the person asking the question or my friend or coworkers asking the question, the video will open with restating the problem and then solving it. So I'm going to try to have just, you know, periodically, whenever it comes up organically, Blender videos, usually pretty short, but I do have an idea for some tutorials I would like to do. So I might do something, a complete scratch tutorial, but yeah, so I just created this channel today, and I hope you enjoyed.